Now I'm going to hold on your hand as either a private pilot looking to get their instrument rating or a student pilot when I say this, but it isn't a surprise that the weather isn't always great. We have a number of reasons why the weather won't particularly be VFR all the time. Whether it'll be fog, low-lying clouds, weather formations, or whatever else that happens. Weather is pretty unpredictable when we speak about aviation. Now, let's think about something for a second. Imagine you're driving your car and it starts to rain. What about even heavy rain? Well, what would you do in that case? Well, I personally would hope that you're still looking outside to see the car in front of you, even if you can't see that well. But what if we're flying? Flying an airplane? It isn't always the case that we can see our surroundings, and we can't really drive a plane down to the runway like this. So, what do we do in these situations? Well, lucky for us, the FAA and other countries too have found a solution to this problem. We have something called instrument approach procedures, or instrument approaches to help us navigate through weather and get us down to the runway to make a safe landing. The complete and true definition of an instrument approach is as follows. An instrument approach procedure is a series of predetermined maneuvers by reference to flight instruments with specified protection from obstacles and assurance of navigational signal reception capability. It begins from the initial approach fix, or where applicable, from the beginning of a defined arrival route to a point where 1. A landing can be completed, or 2. If a landing cannot be completed or is not completed, to a point at which holding or an en route obstacle clearance criteria apply. And this is from the FAA pilot/controller glossary. Now, it'll come as another surprise that not all instrument approaches are created equal. Some may have different equipment requirements, different minimums, and overall different procedures. What you need to know is that there are three main types of instrument approach procedures, those being precision approaches, non-precision approaches, and a third category known as approaches with vertical guidance, or APVs for short. We'll start with the first one, precision approaches. The main examples of this being your run-of-the-mill ILS approaches, otherwise known as the Instrument Landing System, your PAR approaches, or Precision Approach Radar.
Slightly left course and correcting slowly. Begin descent.
And probably you'll run into later on in your career, or not even at all as a private instrument-rated pilot, your GBAS landing system, otherwise known as GLS. Now, the true definition of a precision approach is any approach that provides you with both lateral and vertical guidance using ground-based navigation systems in many cases. Now, this is due to FAA and ICAO definitions that keep the criteria pretty strict for precision approaches, and you'll see that that also kind of changes the way you need to think about certain kinds of approaches, which we'll discuss later on in the video. Let's go ahead and take a look at an instrument approach plate. Here we have the ILS runway 10 into Lakeland Linder International Airport in Central Florida. We can tell it's for this airport due to the information given in the top right corner. And above the information that we were talking about, you can also see what kind of approach we're talking about, which will say the ILS or LOC localizer into runway 10. Now let's look at the top right real quick. The missed approach procedure is directly given to us in textual form in the event that we cannot continue this approach and must go missed. Now, if you have never looked at an approach plate before, you might be a little confused by what this means, but don't worry, we'll go over it and we'll go over the entire plate just so we understand what a missed approach procedure is. Now, the procedure has us make a climb straight out to 1,000 and then continuing/making a climbing left turn at 2,000 on a heading of 29 or 2. To which we then follow and intercept the 330 radial of the Lakeland Vortac to Plummy intersection, found also at 33.4 DME from the PIE Vortac, and we'll hold there. The visual procedure is also found just by looking a bit below the textual version and also found in the top right of the profile view for an easy interpretation. In this case, it's not shown in this box since there is an alternate missed approach fix which may also be used in lieu of the published missed. Before we continue with how to fly a precision approach, let's understand the different aspects of an instrument approach plate and how to brief it. At the top, highlighted in green, we have what's known as the approach briefing strip, which includes all the pertinent, crucial information for you to know while flying this approach. We have to take into account that before even starting to read the approach or even brief it, it's important to make sure that the plate is current using the dates found on both the left and the right of the plate, which will tell us if this plate is current and whether or not the information is out of date. Starting from the left to the right, we first have our type of nav aid. In this case, for both approaches, it'll be the localizer slash DME on the airport with the identifier India Lima Alpha Lima, or ILAL. It's important to verify that we've entered the correct frequency. It is also important that we properly identify the localizer, just like you would a VOR using the Morse code. Your final approach course, in this case 096, available landing distance, known as 8,500 for this approach, touchdown zone elevation, which is 132, and this will come in handy later, and the airport elevation are also found here. Below these, you'll find any notes that illustrate any changes to procedures to the approach under certain circumstances, and also in many cases, what kind of equipment is required for the approach over that. In our case, for Lakeland, we can see that circling to runways 8 and 26 are not authorized slash not allowed at night. To the right of the notes section, you'll find the type of approach lighting system and the textual missed approach procedure that we discussed earlier. Below this, you'll find all the appropriate frequencies you might need while coming into Lakeland, such as your ground, your approach, ATIS, tower, and any other applicable frequencies. Next, we'll look at the plan view. This is basically a top-down view of your procedure with arrows and symbology to describe different things, and an approach will always start in an initial approach fix labeled IAF, unless you're given vectors to final. In our case, we can most likely plan on going direct to Airshow or Alpha Romeo Sierra Hotel Whiskey to start this procedure. Some procedures may also have an IF, or intermediate fix, along the approach course. Intersections are labeled as INT and will often include DME symbols along with a little symbol looking like a little D to represent their DME distance from a specific nav aid. In our situation, Plummy is our intersection and is defined by the Lakeland and St. Petersburg, or PIE radials of 330 for the Lakeland VORTAC and radial 067 at 33.4 DME from the PIE VORTAC. So for an instrument approach, you have to follow specific instructions, and here we can see that the 4500 and 2700 found on the left side of this instrument approach plate have a line both under them and over them. What this means is that you have to be within these altitudes upon reaching airshow and hold, if applicable, within these altitudes. In the plan view, you may also see additional depictions of airspace such as the Lake Placid MOA, and lastly, the minimum safe altitude for the approach given in sectors of radials in relation to the Lakeland VORTAC. It'll also display any obstacles and their altitudes if there are any near the final approach course. Some important notes to keep in mind is that if a number is underscored, you must fly at or above that altitude. If it's overscored, you must fly at or below that altitude. And lastly, if it's underscored and overscored, it's a mandatory altitude, meaning you have to be either at that altitude or if it's a block of altitude like we discussed here, somewhere in between those two. Remember, the same thing applies for airspeeds if they're applicable on any instrument approach procedure. If you're flying a non-precision approach, such as a localizer approach, step-down altitudes apply. When flying a precision approach, you just have to follow the restrictions only until you intercept the glide slope. There's also something else that's very particular about the plan view, and that's the addition of a minimum safe altitude found in the bottom left. Now, the minimum safe altitude is a safe altitude that's expressed in feet above MSL, depicted on an approach chart that provides at least 1,000 feet of obstacle clearance for emergency use within a certain distance from the specified navigation facility or fix. Basically, if you lose situational awareness, you'll want to climb to this altitude to avoid hitting anything. But wait, let's go back to something. How do we know whether to hold in lieu of a procedure turn or not? or whether to even do a procedure turn. Well, lucky for us, the FAA tells us in the AIM specifically. If you want to check it out for yourself, AIM 5-4-9 tells us that the procedure turn, or hold in lieu of procedure turn, is a required maneuver when it is depicted on the approach chart, unless cleared by ATC for a straight-in approach. It's pretty straightforward. If a procedure turn is published and you don't fall into one of the buckets defined in 14 CFR Part 91.175 or receive a straight-in approach clearance, you're expected to fly it. Remember, you can always ask the controller if you're unsure.
I've been talking to you the whole time. That's the whole point of talking to you.
You have to have a Bravo clearance. You have to request a Bravo clearance.
The Bravo clearance about 50 miles ago.
Nobody clears you through the Bravo but me.
Then clear me through.
No.
Yes.
You're a
She's being an ass. That is not appropriate language.
Now, moving on to the next section, the profile view. This essentially gives pilots the same information found on the plan view, except now it's a cross-section of that information. A few symbols to note here are the final approach fix. One of the profile view's unique features is that it actually marks the final approach fix distinctively. Precision approaches such as an ILS use a jagged arrow to mark the definition of the final approach fix, and basically this is just the point where you intercept the ILS glide slope. Non-precision approaches, such as a localizer, VOR, LNAV, or NDB, use a Maltese cross for the final approach fix. At this point, you should start descending to the minimum descent altitude. These two icons are often, but not always, co-located, so take care to follow the icon that fits the type of approach you're flying. The next kind of symbol that you'll probably see very commonly on instrument approach plates is a VDP. You could see a bold V marked on many straight-in, non-precision approaches. That V represents the visual descent point, or VDP. If you see the runway by the time you arrive at the VDP, you're allowed to descend below MDA, and this will pretty much give you a stabilized, manageable descent down to the runway. Another symbol you'll see is the missed approach point, or MAP, and that is the last point by which you should decide to land or execute a missed approach. Remember, when you're flying a precision approach, your descent is continuous. You're allowed to fly down to the decision altitude, which becomes your missed approach point. That means that the missed approach point isn't a fixed point for precision approaches. It really just depends when you reach the DA. That's why the profile view for precision approaches won't have a missed approach point marked. The solid approach path line simply changes into a dashed missed approach path line. Some notes in this section can be crucial to flying this approach properly. In this case, we can see that the angle of the glide slope for the ILS on the bottom left, and how it's not coincident with the visual glide slope angle of 3 degrees. But the only difference between the two is with the visual glide slope, a threshold crossing height of 71 feet versus 55 feet with the ILS. And basically, in layman's terms, this is the altitude at which your airplane should be crossing the threshold if you were on glide slope. Now, some of the waypoints also have what are known as step-down altitudes, but remember, since we're planning to fly the ILS, we follow the glide slope down to our minimums, so they don't apply in this instant. Distances between these points are shown below in nautical miles for convenience, and these points and altitudes would apply if we were flying the localizer approach, seeing as that is a non-precision approach. The visual procedure for the missed is also pictured on the top right of this section. Below this, we have the minimum section, where we find our altitudes at which we must abide to. In our case, for the ILS, or straight-in ILS 10, we have a DA of 332 feet with 1,800 feet of RVR. RVR means runway visual range and is used at some larger airports that have the equipment for it. You may also see another form of visual range depicted in statute miles. But I have a conversion table here just so you can understand what the conversion goes into, because you can be and probably will be using RVR in many of the airports that you fly into. The DH is also shown as the number right of your minimums and left to the numbers of the parentheses. You won't have to worry about the numbers in the parentheses because they aren't for civil use, but you'll at least know how to find the DH there, and that's pretty important. Now, the main difference between the two is that your DA is your altitude in MSL, It's the number you'll see on your altimeter whether you're deciding to continue the approach or to go missed. Your DH, however, is not a number that you'll particularly see on your altimeter, but it'll be the height above ground or your height in AGL when you come to that point, either deciding to go missed or to continue the approach. Now, the letters above the minimums will signify what approach criteria we're in, defined as either our aircraft's VREF speed, if applicable, or calculated as 1.3 times the stall speed in the landing configuration. You'll see the different approach categories and the speed in knots to kind of put the two together to see which your aircraft is in. Sometimes these approaches will not have the same minimums for all type of aircraft, although it's safe to say that we probably won't be flying a super fast jet anytime soon, so we can probably just worry about categories A and B for now. Lastly, we have an airport sketch showing the airport layout and runway pattern. The sketch is aligned to true north, and you'll find it on the lower left or the right side of the approach plate. The main benefit of an airport sketch is that it increases your situational awareness. It'll allow you to consider other runways if they're better suited for your approach. You can also consider them as backups in case of an emergency. Each runway has its dimensions labeled alongside it so you can judge if it's appropriate for your aircraft. The sketch also indicates the approach lighting system for each runway to make the identification of it easier. Now for the actual brief. Everyone has a different way of doing it, but I like to do it something like this. If we're looking at the same plate that we were talking about originally, we're looking at the ILS for Lakeland. And the way I like to brief it is usually something like this. We're going to be shooting the ILS runway 10 into Lakeland Linder. Plates are current. Localizer frequency is on 110.1 with an identifier ILAL. We'll put that into our nav1. Final approach course is 096 degrees with a runway landing length of 8,500 feet. Touchdown zone elevation is 132. Airport elevation is 142. The ATIS is on 118.025. We're talking to Tampa approach on 120.65. Lakeland Tower is set in the standby on 124.5, and once we get on the ground, we'll go to 121.4 and contact ground. Our minimum safe altitude in this case is going to be 2,700 feet, seeing as we are below the bearings of 130 and 260 to the Lakeland VOR, and that's within 25 nautical mile radius. Now, we're going to proceed direct air show here, and we need to make sure that we're below 4,500 but above 2,700, and after we pass air show, we'll go down to 1,700, our glide slope intercept altitude, and we'll follow the glide slope down to our minimums of 332 feet. Now, once we get to 332 feet, we'll make our decision as to whether to continue the approach or go missed. If we decide to go missed, we'll make a climb straight out to 1,000 feet, and then a left turn heading 292 to 2,000 to intercept the radial 330 from the Lakeland VOR and direct to Plummy. For the entry into this hold, it's either going to be teardrop or direct, and it's going to be right-hand turns. Now, are there any questions, comments, concerns, or additions? It's really important to brief this approach as if you were actually talking through the procedure, because it's really easy to start reading the approach plate like a book, and you'll go over a lot of unimportant things that'll probably just take more time and increase your workload. Now that we understand the basics, let's go ahead and try another approach. This time, we'll take a look at a non-precision approach to see the major differences in it. Here we have the RNAV 13 in Airglades, or 2IS. This is a non-precision GPS approach. The definition of a non-precision approach is any approach that doesn't offer vertical guidance, this being one of them. Another type can be VOR and NDB approaches, as well as circling approaches, but we can get into that in another video. Now, taking a look at this approach plate, we can see one major difference. On the minimum section, we aren't flying this approach to a DA, but rather an MDA, which stands for minimum descent altitude, meaning we can't descend below this altitude unless we have all three of these things checked off. One is that we've identified the runway environment. So to descend below MDA, a pilot must distinctly see and identify at least one specific visual reference within the runway environment. Now, if you only have the approach lighting system, such as the sequenced white flashers, you can only descend to 100 feet above touchdown zone elevation, and that is another reason why it's particular to actually brief that in your approach. However, if you have the red terminating or side row bars, you can actually descend below 100 feet above touchdown zone elevation and land if you have the rest of these criteria met. There is a difference, however, when you have the actual runway environment in sight, such as the runway threshold markings, 1,000 footers, anything like that. That'll allow you to actually go down below your MDA and execute a landing if you have the rest of these criteria met as well. The second thing you need to do is maintain a safe landing position. So the FAA requires an approach below MDA or DA to be in a continuous position for a normal landing using normal maneuvers. Now, they don't really define what exactly a stable descent or a stable approach is, but you can consider anything around 500 feet per minute to be a stable enough approach. The other thing is that you can't use extreme maneuvers to get down, so if you're using a forward slip to try and get down to the runway, you're probably not making a legal IFR landing. Lastly, is that your required flight visibility minimums have to be above what is on the instrument approach plate. Keep into account that this doesn't refer to what is actually being referred on the airport, because if you have more flight visibility than what's prescribed at the airport at any given time, you can actually go down and land. So, on a precision approach, we follow the glide slope down to our DA. In this case, we'll use step down fixes to go down to our MDA. There's also another thing that exists if you have WAS capable GPS, which will basically give you LNAV plus V, which is an additional capability that'll give you an advisory glide path to help you get down to your MDA. Just remember to comply with all of the altitudes charted. Lastly, we can look at one more type of approach, and that'll be the last category. They're known as APVs, or approaches with vertical guidance. Let's take a look at the RNAV 9 left in Opa-locka in Miami. So taking a look at this plate, you can remember what I said about RNAVs and their non-precision nature? You might be about to break your phone or computer when you see that there's an RNAV flown to DA.
Can I get black olives? Can I get some?
But this doesn't mean that they're precision approaches. As I said before, the FAA and ICAO standards are too strict for them to be considered as such. However, LNAV, VNAV, and LPV are in their own categories, known as approaches with vertical guidance. They're flown exactly like an ILS or another precision approach down to a DA, and you can choose whether to go missed at that DA. LPVs stand for localizer performance with vertical guidance, meaning that they're more sensitive as you get closer, and a specific type of GPS, known as a WAS GPS, is required to fly an LPV. You don't need a WAS GPS to fly LNAV VNAV, but you do need a barometric VNAV system. So those are pretty much the basics of instrument approach procedures. They're not that complicated. In other videos, I'll show you more topics about IFR, but for now, you know the basics of an instrument approach, how to brief it, and you could also let me know what you think in the comments. If you have any questions or additions or anything that you think I may have got wrong in the video, feel free to put them in the comments. And you can also suggest other topics for me to do, either within IFR or maybe out of IFR as well. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.